Hello and welcome to the Courtney Turner podcast. My guest today is Michael Walsh. He is a dear friend of mine. He is a brilliant, and very prolific author and also a very talented musician, a journalist. He was a professor, and we are going to discuss his latest book, A Rage to Conquer. And the theme of today, I think, is going to be masculinity, the feminist movement. This is, I'm sure, to my audience, these topics are not going to be strange at all. And I'm really looking forward to what he has to say. I actually haven't read this one, but I have read his books, and he is a truly incredible writer. I mean, just a wordsmith, very, very engaging and poetic and everything, even though sometimes he writes about things that are actually quite dark. But he does it with quite a flair. So, Michael, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm so happy to see you, Courtney, and thank you for having me on. And I'm so proud of you for all that you've accomplished with this podcast since the last time I saw you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I really do. It's so good to see you. It's been quite a while. So
yeah. Well, let's make some friends and influence people, or some enemies, whatever.
Well, one of the two, right? Yeah. Well, if you haven't made some enemies, you're probably not doing life right. So, right? Who said that? Was that Churchill, or I think so?
Yeah, I do think as I have passed my 75th birthday, that a man is best judged by his enemies, not his friends. So I'm very proud of the enemies I have, and I love the friends I do have.
I couldn't agree more. So for my audience who is not as familiar with you and your work, can you give us a little overview of your background? Because it is quite fascinating. Yeah.
Well, I was born on the Marine Corps base at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, which is on the east coast of North Carolina on Oslo Bay. It's one of the prime military Marine bases on the East Coast, along with Quantico, Parris Island, et cetera. And then my father fought in Korea. He's a decorated Korean War hero. He is almost 99 years old. He'll be 99 years old on June 1st, which, by the way, for those scoring at home, that is Marilyn Monroe's 99th birthday as well. So when we were kids, we used to say, Dad, how come you didn't marry Marilyn Monroe? You guys are born on the very same day. So he went to Korea and then came back.
Did he answer that?
Well, my mother was prettier than Marilyn Monroe, so I think he was quite happy with the decisions he made. And then we grew up in California on the Marine Corps Recruit Depot base at San Diego for 8 years, and then a couple more years in Honolulu, where I went to high school, half a high school in St. Louis High School, and we lived at Pearl Harbor. And then back to Washington, as Marines always do. And I finished high school in Arlington, Virginia, and went to the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, as a 17-year-old freshman. And that's where I was for all of the 60s fun, Courtney, which your generation has missed. And you contemptually dismiss us old farts as baby boomers, but we are baby boomers. And remember that we invented sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So don't get uppity with us.
Not the CIA?
No, not that. And then I went into newspapers, and I did newspapers in Rochester and in San Francisco, and then Time Magazine called me. Actually, they sent somebody to California to talk to me about taking over the music critic's job at Time, which was in its last glory days, where really no expense was spared to get the news and to hire the best writers in America. And so I spent the next 16 years doing that, which involved getting on a plane every couple of weeks, going somewhere like Tokyo or Berlin. Or one case, I went to Russia with Vladimir Horowitz in 1986, which was the same time that Chernobyl blew up while we were there. So that was fun. And I was at the Berlin Wall in 1989 when it came down, and took a big chunk of it myself. And it's in my study here in Connecticut. So I've had some good adventures, and then I left all that after 25 years and said I wanted to do my own work. And I wrote my first novel. The rest has gone from there. So the new book, A Rage to Conquer, is my 20th published book, and I will get 21 is under contract, and 22 is in my head. That'll be a novel.
And
that'll be it.
Is that?
Then I'll be
Wrath with God, is that I think I've heard you say that's that the title?
Yes, the new book, which will be a sequel to this book, Rage to Conquer, is called The Wrath of God.
Yeah.
And it's about religious warfare, starting with the Hebrews and the Canaanites, in chapter 1 of the Bible, and going up to more or less the present day, which brings us back to the Jews and the Palestinians. So there's kind of a nice loop to it. And then the novel is,
yeah.
well, the novel is going to be a big work. I tell people it's going to be longer than War and Peace, but twice as funny as War and Peace. So
we need the humor.
So that's what I'll do. And then in my old age, I've decided to become a concert pianist again, which I was when I was in my 20s. And so I gave a concert last fall in Budapest in Hungary, and this year I'm going to play in London and Budapest again. So it's fun.
Yeah, that's quite a ride.
Other than that, I don't do anything.
Right. Sitting on your thumb, sitting and twiddling your thumbs. Yeah. So,
yeah, I surf the internet all day.
Yes. Oh, well, that too. What compelled you to write this latest book as the sequel?
Well, I wrote a book called Last Dance, which was a super hit, unexpected by everybody. You never know which book's going to click and which isn't. And Last Dance was sold out in the first week of publication, and they had to go back and print 40 or 50,000 more of them. It just resonated. I don't know why. It's a story about literally last stands and famous and not so famous battles.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it was great timing also.
It was love.
Yeah.
Love. But it did so well that they asked me to write a second book of military history. So I chose this one, A Rage to Conquer, which is about 12 battles, very arbitrarily chosen by me and linked in ways that we'll discuss as we go, I hope. And that's now out. So I'm doing an event in Los Angeles next Wednesday, which will be at the Lux Hotel on Sunset Boulevard. And I will be speaking at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, where I'm also teach from time to time, up on 16th Street near the White House. And I'll be at the Army and Navy Club, which is the premier club for military people in DC. And that'll be in October and a few other places. But those are the audience. I'll be talking at West Point, too, at some point in the fall. So we get to talk to the Army guys directly. They love having Marine kids come in and talk to them about how to do their jobs. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. And yeah, there I am there on the IWP. So that's what's coming up. This book is about men, and so was Last Dance. But I decided to take that theme farther and to get very reactionary and politically incorrect, which, as you know, I've always been, but advocate for primal values. I think one of the reasons I'm writing this novel, which is I want to get back to first principles in so many ways. And what are the essential natures of men and women? What's the essential nature of God and creation? How does ontogeny recapitulate phylogeny, as they say in the genetics business? In other words, the smallest thing re-replicates itself ever larger through ripples. And this is an area you're familiar with, ripples through the culture and becomes a macro thing. But it starts as, basically sperm meets egg, and everything develops from that on personal levels, on familial levels, on social structural levels, on national levels, on global levels. So what is, and I'm a big fan of Marcus Aurelius, so what is this thing? Intrinsic nature, not what does the left want it to be. So that's why we got this 4 years spasm of unparalleled stupidity, in which they literally tried to tell you that boys are women and men are women and women are men, or can be if they want to. I think that was a bridge too far for the left. They live on fantasy and alternative reality, but that was a bridge too far because the essentials always keep coming back. And when you go through history, as I've done now in these two books, and will do in The Wrath of God, when I get back upstairs to my office, I get back to work instead of goofing off talking to my friends here on podcasts. When I get back to that, you see it's the same it's the same old story tale, like from Casablanca, Tale of Love and Glory, Do or Die. It's how men relate to women. Why do men fight? What are they trying to protect? What are they trying to prove? Why are men more expendable than women? Why is it that if you have 100 men and one woman on a desert island, in 9 years, you might have 9 kids. If you have one man and 100 women, you'll have 1,000 kids easily. So the nature of the sexes is obviously imbalanced in terms of reproductive strategies. And reproductive strategies are so important for men to pass on what they've acquired and what they've accomplished, and for women to nurture and protect the generations. A woman's first loyalty, as I say over and over again, is always to herself, her own body, and her offspring. That she is the guardian of life in a way. She is the Vestal Virgin who is no longer a virgin. I was in Rome a couple of months ago, and I was walking in the Forum, which is just an amazing experience if you've never done it. And I came to the Temple of the Vestal Virgins, which is very near the Tarpeian Rock, which is where they threw a Vestal Virgin off because she had been compromised by one of the Roman soldiers or politicians. So they prized this sacredness of the female spirit to an extraordinary degree. And it's what allowed Rome to become the greatest empire up to that point the world had ever seen. That lasted from the beginnings of the founding of Rome in 750 something BC to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. That's 2,000 years worth of Greco-Roman civilization. And how did it last? And what were the principles that made it last? I'm very much an opponent of presentism, which is, of course, a lefty thing, which is to judge the actions of the past by the standards of the present. Mm-hmm. So they immediately leap to some conclusion about so-and-so did X, and they find, in this case, a fashionably sexual motive or a fashionably political motive, when in fact, to those people who had no way of knowing we'd ever be here to talk about them, they didn't think about that at all. They had other things on their mind. They had a different view of the purpose of life and the function of the sexes in life. And they just went about their business, and they lived much shorter lives than we do. So they were in a much greater hurry, and because they knew it, to get what they had to do done. Mm-hmm. And so you see in accounts of the early ancients, say Alexander in Greece, and Caesar, and the other Romans moving up to the fall of Rome, that they die sometimes weeping at what they didn't accomplish. So famously on his deathbed, Augustus, who had inherited essentially Rome from Julius Caesar, his uncle who had adopted him, his last words were so moving. He lay there knowing he was about to die, and he said, "I've been a player in a play. Did I do a good job? Did I play the role I was supposed to do?" And those were his last words. Oh. He was very keen on, there he is, he was very keen on how history would remember what he had done. Now, by our standards, he was a coward. He never fought, unlike, say, Mark Antony, who did, although he wasn't a terribly good general. Augustus, Octavian, didn't fight. He let Agrippa do all that dirty work for him, but he put people to death right and left. He swapped wives when he had to for dynastic purposes or for procreation purposes or whatever tickled his fancy. We look at the Romans as very amoral people or immoral people, and certainly post-Christianity. But on the other hand, they would probably consider us very weak and indecisive and silly because we don't take care of obvious problems that could have been solved. So in a way, this book is a long, not an apologia, but certainly a look at the nature of these men, why they did what they did, and how in fighting they solved similar problems. I mean, you'll find that at the Battle of Gaugamela, which is a battle I treat in A Rage to Conquer, it's the crucial battle in which Alexander defeats Darius, the Persian king of kings, and sends him running and eventually to his death. That situation is exactly replicated thousands of years later when Napoleon is at Austerlitz and he is facing a similar foe in the Austrians and the Russians. And he pulls the exact same maneuver that Alexander had done and that worked so well at Gaugamela. He does the same thing. And it works. So these guys had a sense of historical lineage that, Caesar knew Alexander. Famously, Caesar, who didn't get his military career started until he was in his 40s and was getting bald, which he was very sensitive about, and getting fat. And he came across a statue of Alexander when he was proconsul or something in Spain. And he wept because Alexander, by the time he died, which was at age 32, 34, had already conquered the world. Caesar had done nothing by his lights. So he was determined to outdo Alexander. And when you read Napoleon in exile on Elba, he wrote a book on Caesar's battles and analyzed them from a military strategic point of view. It's very interesting because he's highly critical of some of the tactics that he encounters and says, well, Caesar did this and the Gauls did this and I would have done that. And it's sort of Monday morning quarterbacking from a guy that was near death himself. There's Alexander. But it's fascinating to note that they have this continuity. And it's a very masculine thing. I don't think you see the same thing in women. One of the controversial statements that I discovered while I was writing both these books and have said numerous times now in terms of the relationship between men and women gets back to what we were saying earlier about women being the guardians of life, being the protectoresses of the flame that animates the creation. During the Battle of Dorylaeum in the late 11th century, the Crusaders first encountered the Turks, and the Turks ambushed them. An advance guard of the Crusader main force as it was marching. It landed at Constantinople, crossed the Bosphorus, and was into what's now eastern Turkey. And the advance guard got ahead of itself, and the Turks surrounded them and attacked them. The way very similar to the American Indian tactics, say attacking a wagon train. They're very, very similar. And what they found was in those days, the Crusader armies were not just big, beefy guys with swords, but there was a lot of women and children. Their wives, their mistresses, prostitutes would come. Kids born of whatever reason would appear on the trail. And so they had to bring along all of these camp followers with them, this long, long line. And once the fighting started, the women weren't allowed to fight, but they were encouraged, they were demanded to assist the wounded, to give them water. It's very thirsty business fighting, and especially in the heat of the Anatolian summer, and to drag bodies away so they wouldn't get in the way.
Right.
And they were doing their job until the Turks broke through the Crusaders' shield wall. They had to retreat temporarily and put up what they called the shield wall. So the enemy would bang its head against their armaments. But they broke through, and everyone, the Crusader chroniclers noted that at that point, the women immediately stopped fighting and they stripped off naked or they put on their finest clothes and they entreated the Turks to take us to the harems. They switched side like that. And then Bohemond, who was the leader of this particular cohort and the kind of the main character of this chapter, then comes in with his mace and his axe and breaks a few heads. And the girls go, okay. And then they go right back to fighting for the Crusaders. So my point is that it'd be interesting to see what you think about this, Courtney. Women will always go over to the enemy if they feel their men don't want them or can't protect them. They will submit. And you see this in the Arab countries and the Muslim countries. So you look at the Iranians, for example, they have no reason to be Muslim except they were conquered by the Arabs. And they had tried under the Shah to throw off the Sharia extensions. And that's why you saw these beautiful Persian girls in the 50s wearing skirts and bikinis and just looking like Western women. In fact, a good friend of mine as a boy had grown up in Tehran. He was a military kid and loved it. And then Islam comes in, puts women right back into bags. And do they revolt? No, they don't, because there's nowhere to go. There they are, saying that now would get them all hanged.
Right.
And it's my prayer that Iran is liberated from this, because the Iranians are great people, and this human potential that has been wasted thanks to the conquest of Iran is just one of the real tragedies of the world. Losing Constantinople was bad, and Greco-Roman civilization, although the Arabs and the Turks in particular in Constantinople preserved some of it. And in fact, part of what we know about Aristotle and the Greeks came because they had accidentally preserved this stuff instead of wrecking it. So it was able to come re-inject itself back into the Dark Age Western fledgling city-state in Spain, which was under Muslim control till 1492. And so it wasn't an entire loss, but it's sad what's happened to Iran. And I think one of the primary things that American foreign policy should concentrate on, and I've certainly said this to them because you know how many friends I have in the current administration, overthrowing the Islamic Republic should be our main goal, because that will eliminate a great deal of pressure on Israel, for one thing. And it will also give us a very valuable Western oriented ally in a very difficult, dangerous part of the world.
Yeah.
So I hope that our friends at State know that. I'm sure they do, and that's one thing they should concentrate on. But it's this masculinity thing, and the idea that women can stand up and say, no, we're going to go our own separate way, is just not historically valid. It never ends well. It cannot end well. It is a fantasy that can only harm women.
I think that's what it was designed to do. I don't think it was ever.
It definitely is. The destruction of the family, as you know, the work that I've done about the Frankfurt School was one of their key points. Is how do you break a society? Well, you have to break it at its, again, autogeny recapitulates philology. You have to stop the sperm from getting to the egg. That will solve the problem, right? So that's certainly contraception. That's abortion. Those things, by the way, have destroyed Ireland within 10 years. You know, I've been spending a lot of time. I have a house there, and my family is there. My daughter is there. My 3 grandchildren were all born in Dublin. But Ireland is not the country it was 10 years ago, because it has been gay marriage came in, abortion got legalized, the Catholic Church got disestablished, and now it's an open borders, anti-white state, which is importing North and Central Africans, mostly at the EU's behest, to change the whole nature of the country. And the Irish have finally, because we're incredibly stupid people, especially the ones that stayed at home, are realizing that this is not good. That in a country of only 4 million people, when you add 1 million complete total cultural aliens, it's a problem. And again, but that's a male thing, because these are not women and children coming to Ireland. These are guys. They're all single men. And when they build these, as Ireland is doing madly, and they don't ask permission, they don't tell the locals, they just put them there. They build these giant camps for them, which are called asylum accommodation. But to me, as someone who actually was born in a Quonset hut on a military base, they look like barracks. I keep saying to the Irish, those aren't temporary housing, they're barracks, soldiers. So one day there will be armed and you will be gone. And that's what's going to happen. But they don't.
The UN plan, right?
It is the UN plan. And it's the Frankfurt School writ large. It's this break down national borders. Anything European, Western is racist. We owe the world suicide. That's basically so that the world can return to its primeval state. Well, primeval state is not so great. One of my great grandmothers was an American Indian from Nova Scotia, so I know something about the Indian culture. Mm-hmm. I'm amused when white people talk about what great stewards of the land they were and peaceful.
There's a great romanticization of
tomahawk you in a second.
Yeah.
If they got drunk, if they just changed their mind, if you read the accounts of people, mostly women, who were captured, they killed the men, but they would take the women periodically. They weren't rapists. They just had this thing about killing women. They would just sit around and they'd talk and they'd beat your friend, and then one of them would kill you. That would be it. There was no way for the Westerners to anticipate what was going to happen, which is why that was such a bloody war between the whites, the Wasishs, and the Indians, whatever tribe they were, whether it was East Coast Indians, as my great grandmother was, or Apaches and Comanches. Mm-hmm. I think it's just the ignorance of history. Let me just wind up by saying this for my opening argument is fatal. And it's why that they don't teach it anymore, because if they did teach it, you could draw these conclusions for yourself.
Yep.
Instead of having them spoon-fed you. Now, today I wrote a piece about Harvard and how much it deserves, death. And why? Because it's gone so far. It started out as a school to educate Puritan clergymen. Mm-hmm. That's what it's for. Mm-hmm. Boston Latin School, where my late daughter went to school, was the feeder school, created as the feeder school for Harvard. And in my little town here in Connecticut, we have the Hotchkiss School, a very famous private high school, that is the feeder school for Yale. Mm-hmm. So and again, Yale was another Protestant religious fundamentalist establishment that has been so far perverted from its original meaning as to be the exact antithesis of what it started out to be. And I think that's a drift that just happens naturally, and we have to constantly prevent it. I think it's Robert Conquest. One of his laws is maybe this is John O'Sullivan's. Well, John O'Sullivan contributed one of the 3 laws that any organization that is not explicitly right wing over time will become left wing. Mm-hmm. It just will. You look at the Ford Foundation. You look at any of the charitable. Who did they give to? They give to Hamas. Mm-hmm. They give to the Palestinians.
I'm a little more cynical than you. I think there's a more orchestration, infiltration, that it's not just an organic occurrence, but...
Well, they help. No, they push. Once they get in, they push.
Yeah.
But you have this, and I'd like to hear your opinion about this because you're Jewish. Harvard has had 4 Jewish presidents since the 90s. And it's a hotbed of anti-Semitism under 4 Jewish presidents. How did that happen? Did the Jewish presidents encourage anti-Semitism? I don't know. You look at this fellow at Princeton, Eisgruber, who seems to be on the side of the Palestinians. Mm. Is that just a leftist Jewish thing, or what's going on? Tell me. I'm curious.
Well, I think it's a pretty complex answer, but I'll give you kind of my short answer. I think it's a dialectical. It's dialectical in nature, and I think it's intended to be that way. So I think that they use the institutions, particularly the academic institutions, as a hotbed of dialectical warfare. And typically, the dialectic does always progress leftward, and the reason for that is because leftism always progresses towards collectivism. And I think that's the ultimate battle. And I think you could probably speak very eloquently to this as well. But it's ultimately, and I think it is, it's teleological, but it's actually also theological, regardless of whether the people who are involved or abetting the agenda subscribe to the same telos or religion is kind of irrelevant, because ultimately there's the battle between the people who, want to maintain the individual free will, and then people who want liberation, which is a freedom as an end goal, which is collectivist. Right? It's a collectivist end. And so that's why I always say the dialectic does progress left. But I think that they use the institutions, the academic institutions, as a hotbed, because it's a great breeding ground for indoctrination and for asymmetrical warfare. And so I think that's what they were kind of designed to do, unfortunately.
Well, in other words, you can have teleology without faith. Actually, that's what you're arguing. The left would argue that you can, and that's the arc of history to me.
I would argue that it's not, though. So my argument is actually slightly different. I would argue they're using the auspices of it being secular, quote unquote secular, and that is divorced from religion. However, I would argue secularism is actually a religion of itself, and it's really oftentimes masquerading for Luciferianism, if you really want to get down to it. Whether they think that or not, the people involved may not believe. They might not be overt Luciferian. They might not subscribe to or even be aware of Luciferianism, but inherently and intrinsically, that is what they are doing. And that is the battle, right? Because anybody who subscribes to any kind of monistic, monotheistic religion, traditionally Orthodox Jewish or Christian. I don't mean that in the literal Orthodox, but traditional Orthodox, correct thinking, if you will, but the traditional biblical framework, they're going to be under the notion that we are endowed with free will by our Creator, right? And that this is that's why that everything. So we're not the creators. There is a creation, and there was a divine Creator who has endowed us with this gift. And free will, to me, I see it as a conduit for virtue, for morality. It's not an end, but I think that they see it as it's an end, freedom. And so they talk a lot about freedom, but what they're doing is they're steering things towards a collective end goal. And that is the Luciferian agenda, right? That's the immanentization of the eschaton, is to create heaven here on earth, rather than using your free will as a vehicle to hopefully be able to enter the gates of heaven. So I do see that as the ultimate battle. And again, that is separate from whether people believe in it or not. That's still ultimately how it's manifested.
No, I think that's right. I mean, it gets very complex, because in a way, what I was saying about teleology without religion is they have a religion. It's just not what we would consider.
Yeah, and I would just add this, that, secular humanism was actually declared by the Supreme Court as a religion. I don't remember which court case it was. I could probably find it. I think it was I want to say there was one in the 70s and then one again in the 90s. But I could probably pull that up. But yeah, they actually, and it's what led the Aspen Institute to change their name. It was the Aspen Institute of Secular Humanism, and they dropped that. It's just the Aspen Institute now.
I'll be darned. I didn't know that. It reminds me of something, because the ancillary subject is, I read War and Peace recently for the first time. I'd always somehow avoided it, but then I pulled it last year and read the whole thing. Wow. Partly because I wanted to see what Tolstoy had to say about Napoleon, because he was such a major character in this book, A Rage to Conquer, and also for my own fill in the vast lacunae in my own education. At the end of War and Peace, after the heroine sleeps with all 5 of the princes, and finally finds the one that she actually loves, Pierre. He goes on a long tirade about history and the great man theory of history, which Tolstoy does not agree with. He presents Napoleon as a kind of ridiculous figure throughout that book. He's short, he's pink, he's hairless, he's kind of a pampered French dandy. And Napoleon argues that all this stuff, Austerlitz, Borodino, all the major battles Napoleon fought, were just chance, that Napoleon himself had nothing, literal or nothing to do with them. And there's a quote that I use at the beginning of this book from Tolstoy, which is, basically life is chance. You can get killed on the battlefield or you can die in your sleep. My daughter died in her sleep at age 22 for no reason whatsoever, none. Autopsy negative.
Yeah.
So you just don't know. And you have to, if you're a man or woman of faith, then you have to assume that that was in accordance with the will of God, however imperfectly or non-existently you understand the will of God. So I don't think Tolstoy is right, though. I think that it's very clear to me that Napoleon, in my telling of his story, is the first artist as hero. I think he is a seminal figure in 19th and therefore up to World War One, 20th century world history. That here's a guy who was a nobody, really, from this random island that had just gone from Italian to Greek to French control. He was a member of a very minor Italian nobility. He didn't speak French very well. He never did speak French very well, and it's often commented. Soldiers loved him, and he was fluent, but I can't imagine what the American equivalent would be if someone spoke like Arnold Schwarzenegger. If you spoke fluent English, but with this heavy Austrian peasant accent, which Arnold has, it's a little bit comical. Anyway, that was Napoleon. So, but he started out as a novelist. He wanted to be a novelist. He was highly sexualized, like many artists and many world leaders. He had a passionate attachment to Josephine, who had been married before, who had kids. She was actually from the Caribbean. She wasn't black, she was white, but she was born in Jamaica, like Hamilton, born on one of the French islands. But she didn't give him any children, so eventually he divorced her and remarried the daughter of the Austrian emperor and had a legitimate son by him. Napoleon is the hero of Beethoven's Third Symphony. And this is a point I'm going to make in my lecture on Wednesday, that the Eroica Symphony, there's war, is Beethoven's portrait of Napoleon. And in writing, and this is how these things sync up, Beethoven had to blow out the jams of the structure that he had inherited from Haydn and Mozart. So Haydn symphony, Mozart symphony lasts about maybe 20 minutes, 4 movements, 25 mass. So the Eroica lasts almost an hour. It's twice as long, effectively, as anything that came before it. The subject is monumentally bigger. It's about Napoleon. He dedicated it to Napoleon and changed the dedication at the last minute after Napoleon declared himself emperor. But to Beethoven, Napoleon was the first free man. And you know yourself, as you explored this, that the Romantics are all about individual freedom. That you have a line that goes from Napoleon to Beethoven to Byron, who is a major fan of Napoleon. Byron talks about Napoleon all the time. After Napoleon was defeated, Byron was inconsolable, and he ordered and built a carriage that was the exact replica of Napoleon's carriage that he had used to convey himself to Waterloo, which was, of course, the end of Napoleon. From Byron to Franz Liszt, a composer that I study and play his music a lot, and have followed his career since I was a boy. Our birthdays are a day apart, not the same year, obviously, but they're a day apart. So I play a lot of his music on the piano. To Liszt, to Strauss and Wagner. And without Napoleon, of all people, who's not a musician, you don't have all this other stuff. You don't have it because he liberates everybody from the notion that you're stuck in the class that you're born into. You don't have to listen to it. And you just make your own way. And when opportunity knocks, you take it. And he almost didn't take it. At the point of his famous seizure of power, he got cold feet and almost walked out. And then his buddies had to say, "What the hell are you doing? Get back in there and just take charge," It's a masculine trait. I'll tell you a story that my father told me when he first got to Korea in June of 50. So I was 8 or 9 months old at that point. He was at the Pusan perimeter, which is on the southeast corner of South Korea. It was the the last remaining stronghold of the South Korean government at that point, because the North Koreans had attacked en masse, surprise, and they pushed them back, and the Marines landed there. And so my dad had just been promoted to first lieutenant. That's the second rung on the ladder up in Marine Army ranks. And he jumped in a shell hole, and there were a couple of Marines in the shell hole, a couple of dead bodies. And he said, "Who's in charge here?" And they said, "You are, sir." And at that moment, he took command, and he's never not been in command from that instant, because they saw that here, first of all, he was the ranking officer. So, of course, he was in command. And there's the Pusan perimeter in blue there on the screen. But because he's a take charge kind of guy, and he doesn't have time, he's a very masculine man in this sense. He doesn't have time to argue, right? You just do it or don't do it. I like to say, and you tell me if you think this is true, because I know it is, if you take a random group of men, 12 guys, 11 guys, a football team, a baseball team, 9 guys, and you say, and something happens and you've got to organize. In 5 minutes, those guys will form a platoon. They'll know who's the leader. They'll know who's the tech guy, who's the kid that plays right field. You hope they never hit the ball to him. That's what they know.
Yeah.
You take the same amount of women, you get nothing. You get 9 women stabbing each other in the back to see which one will be the queen bee.
Yes. Yeah.
But therefore, we'll have access to the most alpha of the men. Which is part of women's reproductive strategy. Why am I going to date this loser? You have this issue in dating where the 80-20 rule is in effect, where 80% of the women are competing for 20% of the men. And so a lot of girls are going to lose out on that.
Yeah.
And how that has affected women negatively was the Hefnerian notion of Playboy in the 50s and 60s, that women had exactly the same sexual dynamic as men, that they were, in fact, females with male sexual appetites. And that's not true. It's just not true. And so you have a lot of miserable women who gave up on so-called traditional femininity, who now find themselves completely left out in the cult, and that everything they were told that they should desire was actually wrong. And now I had 2 daughters and I have 2 granddaughters, so I've been around young girls for a good part of my life, and I hope I educated my children well. And my surviving daughter is very successfully married. She's a foodie, so she runs a very successful restaurant in Dublin with her husband, and they have 3 kids, and the kids are fantastic. And I couldn't be happier with the way that turned out. But I feel sorry for the women who are on the short end of this 80-20 thing. And I don't know. What do you think? Oh, you have more experience in this.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think 80-20 is actually generous. And I think that it's worse for many reasons. It's worse because of technology. It's worse because of, the whole, trans movement, and, that whole, not just from the, psychological or the actual phenomenon, but also from the agenda, right? All of that. So I actually think it's way worse than that, but it's also worse because of the feminist lie. So I think there are so many women who, I always talk about the Sex and the City kind of lie, because that was my generation, right? I actually firsthand have friends who did the whole carry, like, spend your rent money on shoes. And I mean, it was the dumbest thing ever. And watching this in real time, it was like, you're not in a television show. I don't know how you thought this was going to work out, but okay. You do you. But I mean, I watched these things, but the Samantha lie, right? That, as you were talking about, that women have the same kind of sexual appetites, and that it was cool and it was trendy, and, it made you, this made you more desirable. And the truth was really very much the opposite. And then you had all these women who were told that they should put their careers first and they should put everything on the back burner. And there are a lot of women who, they look back, and 2020 is always hindsight, right? And so they look back and realize, and I see this even from very successfully married with, beautiful families. I see this from even women that, with, what looks like everything. They've got the career, they've got the kids, but they did it a little bit later. And even they will say, I wish I hadn't bought that lie, and that I had started it earlier, and that I hadn't felt the need to do it all. And this is not, I'm not telling women that they can't have jobs, or they obviously, I don't subscribe to that. But it's not the natural instinct. The natural instinct is to be a nurturer. It is to, bring children into the world, and to be, that role in the family. And that doesn't mean that, historically women actually did work, and they were not like, they didn't shy from hard work, even physical work. I mean, many women would, like, historically, they gave birth and went back out onto the field. It's not to say they're weak, but they are different. They have a different role. And, they worked with the family. And I think our modern industrialized society it rarely gives way to that as a potential. And so everything has become so siloed and atomized. And I think by design, it's so that, I think there is a depopulation agenda. It is so that, we don't procreate. There is a transhuman agenda. This whole blurring of genders is very conducive. Trans, it's very mimetic, right? Transgender to transhuman, I do think that's part of the pipeline. And yeah, I think that it's part of also, obviously, culturally, to destroy the family, and also to deracinate humans from not just their biology, but their culture, and everything that makes us what we are. So,
well, that's it. I think the left doesn't like human beings. They think they're an inferior species and need to be somehow either improved via electronics, as Musk wants to do. He's a fundamentally transformational figure. I think it's interesting that we live in a time in which the president of the United States, having literally survived all that he did, has now turned out to be the Emperor Trajan, basically. He wants to acquire Canada and Greenland and Panama and this, that. And Leonardo da Vinci, in the form of Musk, is alive at the same time. That is a quasi-autistic polymath who can literally call his fantasies like, I want to go to Mars. He's going to Mars. He's going to go to Mars. This is extraordinary times. But I think one of the issues for the sexes is the fact that we live so much longer. As I mentioned, my dad's 99, it will be, and my mother died just before, literally hours before her 91st birthday. And in the old days, people died younger, and they knew they were going to die younger, and they knew they had shorter amounts of time. And I think with my generation, in front of yours, we felt we had all the time in the world.
Yeah.
Because we knew we weren't going to die at 30, probably. For example, I live here in one of the oldest villages in New England. And in our cemetery up the road is a gravesite behind the town hall, which includes the guys who fought in the French and Indian War. That's how far back we go here. The town was incorporated in the first half of the 18th century, but it was settled at the end of the 17th century. And we're the young by European standards, but we're ancient by American standards. But if you go look at the gravesites, you'll see the men all die at 20 or 80. That is, they get killed in the course of farm work. They get kicked in the head by a horse. They fall off a cliff. They die of things that men die of because they're much more physically, they're involved in more physically dangerous pursuits. Okay. And the women either die in childbirth or they die at 80. It's that simple. So if you survived your own childhood, which wasn't a short thing, and then your young manhood, where you could get killed fighting Indians or fighting the British or fighting whoever, you could then live on to a reasonably. Remember, when I was a boy, 50 was old. So when I was a kid in San Diego, California, growing up in a brand new housing development that had just been, our house had been probably built the day before we moved in 1954. And the people there were not military people. We lived among civilians, which was odd. And many of them were Okies. It's where Southern California accent comes from. My own accent is basically Southern California, and that's transmitted by Okies. Who you hear it in is Victor Hansen, who's got the old Midwestern pronunciation that old Californians have.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, guys were auto mechanics. One was a doctor. It was a very, what we would call, mixed neighborhood for its time, economically and certainly socially mixed. But it was a good time. You know, the women didn't work; they were moms.
Mm-hmm.
You had a very stable family structure. Now we were odd because Dad would go away. At one point, he left for 2 years. He was on some secret mission in Asia. So we just grew up without a father for a while. In fact, my youngest sister, who's still in her 60s, so she's the baby of the family. She was born a few months after he left on deployment, so he didn't see her till she was almost a year and a half old. But you got used to it, and it was a more stable time. And yes, there were plenty of things wrong with it, and I get this a lot from people who say, "Well, what about the this and what about the feminists and civil rights?" Blah 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 blah. You know, they want to bring presentism back to 1956 and indict everybody who was living in the United States of America at that time. But I think that the 50s morality, and yes, I'm sure some of the wives slept with some of the other guys' husbands or when they were away, and I'm sure they were drunks, and because everybody smoked and drank, which they did in those days. But is it any worse than what we have now? I mean, in other words, what has the liberation gotten us, really? When I was entering the workforce in 1972, I got my first job on a newspaper. It was still possible for a man to earn enough money, and it wasn't much, to take care of a family. His wife didn't have to work. You owned your own house. You had a car. You had one. I mean, I remember our house, there was one bathroom for 7 people. So that's a little tough. But of course, you know, my dad was mostly somewhere in Asia. So it wasn't so bad. But you know, you were kind of lower middle class, but you didn't know it.
Right.
And by comparison with our own grandparents, who in my case were immigrant children or Indians, we had it a lot better than they did.
Right.
And then it changed, and women came into the workforce in massive numbers in the 70s. And effectively, this is my interpretation, and I know the feminists don't agree with it, they replaced men and created superfluous jobs in order to give them work. And now they had a problem with children. Well, who's going to look after the kids? Well, we have to have daycare. We have to have this. We have to have that. And I think really the biggest lie was that when women said, all we want to do is get into the men's locker room and nothing will change. Of course it's going to change. It changed instantly, on the spot. And an institution cannot be the same with women. And the same is true for women in their own groups with men. I spoke a couple of weeks ago at a private club in New York. It's all men. And it was a very comfortable environment. It was different. If there'd been one woman there, it would be different. It just would have been. And that's it's true of everything. I was doing a story a few years back in Louisiana with a very close friend of mine who is now dead, but he was a Cajun boy from Lafayette, Louisiana, which is a unique place. If you've never been there, best food in America. It's on the plains. It's on what they call the prairie in Louisiana, bayous west of. And we were doing a story about Cajun music and Zydeco music. And Cajun music is white and Zydeco music is black. It's just the way it is. It's kind of the same thing, but one's white and one's black. And it's just the way it is. So I wanted to go to a Zydeco concert, and there was one, and it was out in this big dance hall all by itself in the middle of nowhere. And the buildings in the Louisiana prairies are up on stilts. They're up off the ground 3 or 4 feet to prevent critters from crawling in, right? So my friend and his girlfriend and one of her girlfriends and I, we went as a foursome to this club. And at the door, my friend John knew the door guy. Said, "Is it okay if we come in?" Meaning, is it okay for white people to come in here?
Yeah.
And the guy looked at us, he said, "Yeah, I guess it's okay, but we just don't want too many of you. Because it changes things." And it's not racist to say that. It's just truth. And we have to get away from being fearful of using words that have been given new meanings by the left in order to prevent us from using or thinking of the concept of difference and why difference is okay, why diversity is not necessarily a mandate, why tolerance is not necessarily a virtue. I would argue it's not a virtue. I think it's silly, actually. We have to understand that it's okay to think that.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets us back to the free speech argument, which I hosted an event in London in September at the Reform Club in Pall Mall there on our book Against the Corporate Media. And fittingly enough, in the room that we were in at the Reform Club, there was a big statue of John Milton, who was kind of the founder of the free speech movement in the Anglosphere when he wrote the Areopagitico, which he wrote because he was mad about his wife leaving him. I mean, it was a deeply personal matter that he decided to go on. The hill to die on was free expression and not be censored by the government to say whatever he wanted to say. So I mentioned at that in that conference also the two British writers, Trenchard and Gordon, who wrote under the collective name of Cato, as you know, they often took names of these Roman orators, Cicero, Cato, etc.
Right.
And wrote of free speech in this column, which was later picked up by Ben Franklin, and it's often attributed to Franklin, but it really is Cato who said this first, that if a man who cannot call his tongue his own can call nothing his own.
Oh, yeah.
If they can take away your freedom to speak and therefore to think, you're dead. And it's why we have to be First Amendment absolutists. We cannot be. And I would say over the course of years, I've lost a lot of leftist friends who were in the arts, movie business and music, whatever. And up to a certain